You know, my friend Carlos is doing so well over at NOLA. He's going to be there more Saturday nights, and it brings me a lot of pleasure. He's not only a good friend of our show, but we play his music, of course, but he's a really good guy. He's originally from Venezuela, and that's how we got to know him when we were doing programs on Venezuela and talking about what's happening down there. So if you're free on Saturday nights, check out my friend Carlos, because it is really, truly a great show. Let's get back to our friend Barry Jacobsen. I just mentioned Venezuela, Barry. It's crazy down there, but of course Rachel Maddow said it's all because of Donald Trump. I mean, why didn't I think of that one, Barry?
I'm sorry, I lost you. Can you ask that question one more time?
No, I was just saying that my friend Carlos is from Venezuela, and Rachel Maddow just said that everything happening in Venezuela is because of Donald Trump. And then my question to you was, why didn't I think of that one before? Gee, we're going to just blame Trump for the whole thing, right?
Yeah, Rachel Maddow is one of the dopiest people on television. Let me just put that out there. She gets nothing right, no matter what she says. If she said, whatever sentence she says, it's wrong. Whether even the is, the ands, and the does are wrong in that sentence, whatever sentence she uses. So just put that out there. Secondly, the problem with Venezuela is too much leftism. They had a communist dictator, Chavez, who took a prosperous oil producing and exporting nation and turned it into a economic basket case in less than 12 years, getting him and his successor Maduro. So the problem with Venezuela is communism and leftism, and the same sort of philosophy that people like Rachel Maddow believe in.
Right. When you said a communist dictator turns a prosperous country into a basket case, I think there's another example of that not too far from Venezuela, isn't there? I happen to have a connection to that one. Cuba. I mean,
look at Nicaragua. Look at every country where communism has taken over. Look at South Korea and then look at North Korea. The only exception is countries like China that basically are only communist in name, that they've abandoned anything close to communist principles and in fact have embraced capitalism like China has. Socialism, communism always leads to the same place, which is dictatorship.
That's right. And economic malaise or disaster, as we've seen in Cuba and now in Venezuela, where every day it seems to be getting rougher and rougher, the marches. And I don't know how much longer Maduro is going to stay, because at some point I think he's going to be brought down from within. His own people are going to realize that he's too much of a liability. Well, let's talk about Syria. And my point there is, Syria, of course, we took the military action that we took. But what happens now, Barry? It seems like Assad is very defiant. The Russians have become very defiant. What happens now? What do you think happens now with the United States in Syria? Are we going to go back in, or is this pretty much the end of it, Barry?
Well, we have troops in there right now, over 1,000. The numbers are somewhere between 1,000 and 5,000 between Iraq, northern Iraq, and Syria. We have artillery units, about 1,000 Marine gunners went in there to Syria to help bombard Raqqa. And we are supporting directly the Kurds, the Peshmerga, who are a very effective fighting force, but fairly small. The problem is that there is no good outcome. You and I have been talking about this for years, and it seems like it's a slow-moving train wreck. Every time we talk about it, it's the same thing over and over again, because nothing changes quickly over there. It's very small, incremental changes. But the picture is basically leading us to the same place, which is that at the end of the day, somebody we don't like is going to be in charge of Syria. It's going to be Assad, backed by the Russians and the Iranians. One's our enemy, the other's our rival. Or Assad's going to fall, and something like ISIS or Al Qaeda will take over. Jeffersonian democracy is not an option, and a pro-Western government, pro-American government is also not an option anymore. Had Barack Obama gone in there very, very early during the Civil War when it first started, and actively threw his weight behind the Free Syrian Army while it was still free and still not Al-Qaeda, we might have been able to affect some changes, positive changes. But that said, we didn't, and I'm not sure we should have. Civil wars are always a dangerous thing to be getting involved in one side or the other. You often end up getting shot at by both sides, from both sides. And right now it's just a mess. We have the Russians there with air power and air defense systems and troops. We have Hezbollah out of Lebanon, which is a Iranian-backed proxy army. And then we have Al-Qaeda forces, and we have ISIS there, and we have Assad's forces. So there's the one people we like there are the Peshmerga, and they're one of the smaller bunches, smaller groups, and they only care about northern Syria. They don't really care about the rest of the country. They would like to get their own Kurdistan, which is the northern part of Syria, the northern part of Iraq, and pieces of Turkey as well, which is why the Turks have troops there. They're trying to smack the Peshmerga so the Peshmerga don't get what they want. So it's a bad situation, and there really is no good outcome. The only thing good to be said about it is we're beating the hell out of ISIS right now.
Right. I'm concerned about one thing in Syria, and that is that Assad may use chemical weapons again, drawing the United States in, and hopefully we don't go too far in, because I tend to agree with you. I think right now, any involvement in Syria, you really got to think it through, because it's almost like walking into a cave, and you have no idea how you're going to get the heck out. I would also add to what you said that this is another consequence. I don't want to beat up on President Obama too much, but this is another consequence, I think, of his policy in Iraq and the retreat in general. He ran out, and things didn't get any better, Barry.
Well, there's an old saying that is kicked around, and when we talk about foreign policy, the saying is that the power loves a vacuum, or abhors a vacuum, actually. That if there's a vacuum, some power will fill it. And when the United States has decided it no longer wanted to be, during the Obama years, the policeman of the world, and in particular, we're talking about the Middle East, the main power in the external power in the Middle East, we had been since the 1970s, when Anwar Sadat kicked the Russians out of Egypt. We had been the main power there, main power broker there. And Obama wanted no more part of that. He wanted everything to be basically a partnership of equals, run more or less by the United Nations. And that doesn't work. We have no equal. There is only one nation in the world that is capable of the sort of armed diplomacy, which has been the hallmark of American foreign policy now for 60 years, where we can actually leverage through armed force our diplomatic goals. We don't have to just talk. We can talk, and we can talk softly and carry the big stick, sort of thing. And that's very effective. As the guy in The Godfather said, you can get a lot further with a gun and a smile than just a smile. So,
yeah.
So
you can always go back. There's so much in The Godfather. I think that if I ever ran for president, I would watch the movie The Godfather to learn a few things about the use of power, Barry.
and since we're talking about The Godfather, Silvio, think of the scene early in the movie where Don Corleone meets with the guy who will eventually try to kill him, Sollozzo the Turk. And he declines graciously to accept his offer of an alliance. And he says, but since your interests and my interests don't compete, I wish you well. And he goes his way. And then the Turk tries to kill him. There's a lot to be learned from that scene.
Right.
And the first thing that you should learn from that scene is, don't trust anybody. Keep your guard up, keep your gloves up, and go to your respective corners. Don't let the guy get a blindside you. If we go into Syria right now, we have the Turks, Al Qaeda, ISIS, the Russians, and Assad. None of those people like us, and any one of them would love to blindside us.
That's right. Well, my favorite scene from The Godfather is when Michael is they're at the wedding, and he's talking to the woman he will eventually marry, the very pretty lady whose name I cannot recall right now, very pretty movie actress.
Diane Keaton.
Diane Keaton. That's right. And he's explaining to her how Tony got his contract It says, my dad, and he was talking about how my father showed him the contract, and he said, sign it. I forgot what he said exactly, but sign it one way or another, but you're going to sign it, kind of thing. Made him an offer he couldn't refuse. Go ahead.
Made him an offer he couldn't refuse. He said my father made him an offer he couldn't refuse, and she says, what was that? He said either your signature or your brains are going to be on this contract.
That's right. Yeah, and I always thought that was a pretty persuasive way of getting things done, the Godfather way. Well, our last topic today is France, where they're going to be holding an election in the next 24 to 36 hours. And by all accounts, it looks to me like it's going to be they're going to go to a second round. And it is believed that, at least from what I heard, that the candidate from the center left is going to be one of the two, and it appears right now that Marine Le Pen is going to be the other one. And then, of course, we'll see what happens when the next round comes along. But, Barry, my feeling about France, obviously they have very serious problems with immigration that we've talked about before, but I think they have other structural problems that they're not talking about. One of them is, of course, a very generous welfare state that I think has become unsustainable and simply, they just cannot not afford it. And the other problem they have, of course, is the whole question of the birth rates, with the lack of babies and it seems like all of these three things are really happening in France right now. And unfortunately, when I hear somebody like Le Pen, the only thing she seems to be talking about, or at least maybe I'm wrong, but the only thing she seems to be talking about is the borders and immigration. That's important. I understand that. But there's other issues, Barry, that the country faces that are not going away just because you close the borders. So I don't know. That's kind of my sense about what's happening in France, Barry.
Yes. I don't pretend to be an expert on French politics or what's really going on in France in any great depth. It's enough for me to keep up with the ever-changing situation in my own country. But that said, here's what I do believe is going on to some extent. First, let's talk about the election. Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen are the two top polling candidates at this point. Macron is they call him a centrist left. By American standards, he's probably somewhere where Nancy Pelosi is. So we'd say fairly far left by American standards. But in Europe, that's centrist left. And he hurt himself a little bit this week when he basically said, as far as terrorism is concerned, and this, of course, in the wake of the shooting of that policeman, several policemen, one of which died, right there in the center of Paris by a Islamic gunman. He said that terrorism is just something you have to live with. And this, of course, has been really the attitude that Europeans have had since the 1970s when left-wing terrorism by groups such as the Red Brigade and Bader Meinhof and that sort of thing started up. The Europeans have always sort of treated it like an act of God. You arrest these people when you can, but generally they're going to suicide anyway, so you just got to kind of shrug and move on. Marine Le Pen is not of that ilk. She is considered a far-right candidate, though by American standards she'd probably be right in the mainstream of the Republican Party. Center rights by American standards. And she wants not to close the border, but to protect their borders, certainly. And she can't do that within the EU structure. So you can talk about perhaps leaving the EU, or at least to some extent leaving it, rather like Brexit. I guess it'd be Frexit in this case. And getting tough on Islamic terrorism. But the main thing she said that I really admire, and I think is a breath of fresh air in French politics, is that their culture is worth protecting. That multiculturalism is a suicide pact for a nation, particularly when your demographics are such that the typical French Muslim is having 5 or more children each generation, and the native French population is having 1.5 children. So demographically, all throughout Europe, not just France, all throughout Europe, there's a time bomb, demographic time bomb ticking. Within 20 to 30 years, Europe will be predominantly Muslim unless something's done. And we're not talking about immigration either. We're talking about native-born Muslims. People have been in France sometimes in some cases, for as much as 3 generations. Also, there's the issue of assimilation. The Europeans have done a terrible job of assimilating Islamic immigrants. And I can't fully blame them because I don't think you can fully assimilate a people that don't want to assimilate. You see the same thing in the United States with certain segments of the Latino population, the ones who come over from El Salvador or in some cases from Mexico and join groups like La Raza or criminal gangs, for instance. And they have no interest in becoming Americans. They just want to basically live off the system. And that leads me to the third point, which you brought up. You can't have liberal open border policies combined with a welfare state. You just become a magnet for everybody who doesn't want to work anywhere in the world to come over and live off your generous welfare benefits. And that's the problem the United States has. It's a problem Europe has much more than we do. And it can't be solved unless you control your borders and control who gets that generous welfare.
Right. And that may be, probably the reason that I would vote for Marie Le Pen is exactly what you just said. That in order to solve all their problems, they've got to control their borders. They have to control their immigration problem. They really do because, I think she's exactly right, that France should, it should be French. That's what it should be, first, French. And unfortunately, many of these European countries are anything but French or anything but Danish or anything but, Dutch or whatever. They're really going in that direction. And I think, as you said, it is completely counterproductive. You have to assimilate, and again, I speak here from personal experience. We came here, we had to, we had to understand, or we understood, I should say, very quickly that we had to assimilate. Now, our assimilation was a little easier, I'll grant you that, because I knew about the Lone Ranger. I just used to watch him in Spanish. So that's the difference. But still, I knew who the Lone Ranger was, or Rin Tin Tin or all these things. I knew about them. But I
just out of curiosity, how do you say the Lone Ranger in Spanish?
El Llanero Solitario, the Solitary Ranger. That's what it was called. That's what it was called. El Llanero means ranger, and Solitario means solitary. So he wasn't called a Lone Ranger. And I guess as long as you're asking the question, I'll add another thing to your knowledge in Spanish of the Lone Ranger. His good sidekick up here, what was his name? Canto, right? Yeah. Well, Canto means fool in Spanish.
Does it really?
Yeah. Tonto means fool in Spanish. So I don't know if Tanto's name was an Indian name that sounded Spanish. I don't know. But when they took the show to the Spanish-speaking world, and by the way, Cuba was the first place that those shows went to in the 1950s, because Cuba, getting back to what you were saying before about prosperity, Cuba had, Mexico to some extent too, but Cuba in particular had a very advanced television system, a couple of stations and all of that would broadcast. So when they took it to Cuba, they changed the name to the Solitary Ranger. But when they looked at his sidekick, and they said, well, we can't call this guy Tonto in Spanish. So they changed the name to Toro, Toro, which means bull. So that's your trivia question for the Lone Ranger there, Barry. You can win the next Trivial Pursuit game if that question comes up.
Well, thank you for that. I can't. Every time we have a conversation, I always come away maybe 1/10% smarter than when I began the conversation.
Well,
which is why I
come away. Well, I come away like 100% smarter because I always learn so much from you on national security. But at least we know that Peter Frampton was a part of Humble Pie. That important information we now know for for the next generation to learn. But thank you as always, Barry, for joining me, and we'll get back to World War II the next time. I think next time we're still in, I believe, 1942, right? When we get back into it.
Yes, when we get back, we actually are going to be in the Battle of Stalingrad, the end of 1942, right. And the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. That was the big turning point.
That's right. That's right. They've been running this movie. I know it's not exactly about the same thing, but they've been running this movie, The Enemy at the Gates. They've been running that movie for some reason quite a bit here lately, and it's just an amazing man. That's a bloodbath. I hate to say anything else about that movie. That's one of the most unbelievable movies I've ever seen, Barry.
Well, it shows you the Battle of the Rats, the underground battle in the ruins of Stalingrad that took place between late summer 1942 and the early winter at the end of the year. In December, we're going to pick it up in November, but in December the worm turned, so to speak, and the Russians went on the offensive, and the Germans found themselves surrounded and embattled in the city they had been trying to capture for 4 months. So we'll talk all about that. I got one more thing to give you and your listeners before we leave.
Sure. Go ahead.
You've always heard the saying, if at first you don't succeed, try again. Well,
that's right.
I would amend that by saying, if at first you don't succeed, go back and do it the way your wife suggested in the first place.
Well, I've been through a few of those words of wisdom myself.
You know, anybody who's got a wife, generally, if you just did it the way she told you to begin with, you would have saved yourself a lot of heartache.
Yes. Well, my mom used to say the same thing about that. Why didn't you do it your way? I told you how to do it. I told you how to do it, but you had to do it your way. Yes, Mom, you're exactly right. So let's just say that's a female intuition. Is that the right way to put it? They just seem to, sometimes they kind of know the way it should be done, and we decide to change it, and then we have to go back and do it the way they always told us to do it, Barry.
Well, it's the way their female brains work different than ours. You know, today's the day that they're having the March for Science, as you know, and it's being led by Bill Nye, the so-called science guy. I say so-called because he's not a scientist. He's got an undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering, and he's in a comic. But that said, he calls himself a science guy. But you know, they're having this March for Science, and one of the things that always amused me about the left when it comes to science is that they deny the basic science of biology, which is to say that men and women are not the same. We are different. We're not simply hairier than women. We think differently than women, and they think differently than us. And I think their brains are sometimes much better at solving puzzles than ours are. And a man who doesn't listen to his woman.
Well, I lost you there for a minute, Barry. I don't know what happened. I lost you there just as you were praising womanhood. I lost you, so I don't know what happened. Just as you were praising women, I lost you. I thought maybe somebody had cut off your connection there. But just as you were praising women. But I will say one thing on a farewell, and just a quick thumbs up for our friend Leslie. She wrote a really good piece today over at Legal Insurrection about the projections that they made back in 1970 on Earth Day. And if you want to read what they were saying back then in 1970, it's entertaining to say the least. Because according to what they were projecting on Earth Day 1970, we wouldn't be doing a show tonight, Barry.
Well, that's true. And keep in mind, it wasn't just 1970 where they made stupid predictions. I believe in his documentary, was Uncomfortable Truth or
Inconvenient Truth.
Inconvenient Truth. Al Gore was saying by 2016, New York City would be underwater.
Right. We'd be doing this show in a submarine if we had listened to Al Gore. We would have bought a submarine and done the show underwater if we had listened to Al Gore. Well, have a great week, Barry. Have a great weekend, and hopefully we'll talk very soon. I'm looking forward to our next show.
Next segment on the Battle of Stalingrad. You have a great weekend, Silvio, and it's been a pleasure.
You too. Thank you. My pleasure as always. Oops, I hit the wrong music, but that's okay. I hit the wrong music. Sorry about that. Let's do this all over again. Thank you, thank you, Barry, for listening, for being on our show tonight, and thanks to all of you for listening. I hit the wrong button there, and that's why we got that little music that we weren't supposed to get. Good night, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas.